Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking exactly what it takes for modern leaders to drive massive innovation, especially if you're leading diverse teams or looking to expand into international markets. And the secret weapon here? Well, it's not some fancy new software system or a sneaky pricing strategy. It turns out it's mastering cultural intelligence. In a world that is just more interconnected than ever before, the ability to understand, adapt, and navigate across completely different cultural backgrounds isn't just a nice-to-have soft skill anymore. It is an absolute business imperative.
But, before we get to the winning strategies, we really have to look at the risks. Why do literal corporate titans just fall? Think about giants like BlackBerry, who once totally dominated the corporate smartphone market, or Swiss Air, which was once the absolute darling of the airline industry. They collapsed with astonishing speed, simply because they refused to see the changing world around them. They snubbed the trends, they ignored the shifts, and they basically just blinded themselves to reality. In fact, research points to this specific blindness as the single biggest root cause of organizational failure. And what's truly fascinating here is the sheer scale of the shift we're living through right now. The demographics are fundamentally changing. Just look at the data. In Canada, a staggering 65% of the population is multicultural. And in the United States, we're already sitting right at 40%. So the multicultural era isn't some distant sci-fi future projection. It is already here, heavily driven by global trade and a massive digital revolution. To thrive in this environment, we absolutely have to become culturally fluent.
Okay, so let's dive into this. We'll be covering 4 key areas today. 1. Identifying the 6 Deadly Blindfolds. 2. Developing a multicultural mindset. 3. Mapping out the 4 cultural orientations. And 4. Building global trust.
Starting with Part 1, the 6 Deadly Blindfolds. These are the cognitive traps that cause global ventures to fail.
If you've ever watched a hugely successful domestic strategy just completely flop overseas, you are very likely dealing with organizational blindness. There are essentially 6 cognitive traps that cause these failures. First up is arrogance, like Walmart assuming its US tactics would seamlessly translate abroad, only to find out, very quickly, that they absolutely did not. Second, creating a toxic environment where negative feedback is just flat out ignored. Third, dismissing your competitor's success as just luck. Fourth, that arrogant belief of we know what's best for the customer. Fifth, pretending problems don't even exist, like GM tragically ignoring their ignition switch issues for literally a decade. And finally, avoiding the unavoidable, ignoring massive systemic economic shifts until it's way too late.
At the very heart of all these blindfolds is one central concept: tunnel vision. It happens when individuals only see their own culture. And sure, on one hand, it can build a localized identity, but the massive downside is that it fuels a really dangerous tribalism. It creates this us versus them mentality that directly fosters antagonism toward outsiders. In a multicultural multiverse, where cultures are constantly intersecting and colliding, operating with tunnel vision is essentially a guaranteed path to obsolescence.
Which brings us to Part 2, the multicultural mindset. This is the paradigm shift from tunnel vision to true cultural fluency.
So, to actually survive and thrive, leaders have to completely abandon that limiting tunnel vision. The source material reveals you can actually measure your readiness for this through your MQ, or multicultural quotient. It operates across 3 distinct dimensions. First, awareness, like how comfortable are you with the basics of another culture's customs and values? Second, adaptation. How effectively do you bridge the gap between your way of doing things and theirs? And finally, application. How do you take all this and actually apply it to real-world, everyday team leadership?
Applying this means fundamentally changing how we lead. And wow, is there a stark contrast here. The outdated I-centric boss is dictatorial, fiercely protects their territory, and demands absolute conformity. But the modern, culturally fluent leader, they are we-centric. They act as a facilitator, sharing accountability and deeply, genuinely valuing diversity. And if you think this is just some feel-good HR exercise, the data completely proves otherwise. A major BCG study of 1,700 companies found that diverse executive teams financially outperform their peers. It's a highly measurable, undeniable competitive advantage.
Let's move to Part 3, the 4 cultural orientations. This is how we map out team dynamics in international markets.
So, how do we decode the everyday, on-the-ground behaviors of our global teams? Well, we use a really brilliant framework called the Model of Freedom. This essentially maps out how different societies rank across 4 crucial categories: how they view authority, how they handle rules, the value they place on individuality, and the importance of specific roles. Understanding exactly where a culture sits on this scale is how you prevent fatal miscommunications before they ever happen.
And this brilliantly illustrates those differences. When we break it down, it's striking. If you're dealing with an action-oriented culture, like the US or the UK, they typically want quick decisions and extremely fast results. But contrast that with a process-oriented culture in Latin America. They highly value complex rules and context, taking their time to make highly informed decisions. Meanwhile, task-oriented cultures in Northern Europe value blunt, straightforward discussion, but treat leaders as equal facilitators. Finally, role-oriented cultures in regions like Asia and Africa rely on strict rules and a deep, deep respect for hierarchy. Let me tell you, if you try to manage a role-oriented team with the aggressive, fast-failing style of an action-oriented manager, you are literally guaranteeing team failure. Because ultimately, even the very definition of trust changes depending on where you are. The source material shares this absolutely incredible anecdote. An Austrian manager traveled to Algeria for a big meeting. During the discussion, the Austrian naturally took a written contract out of his briefcase just to clarify a point. Well, the Algerian counterpart was deeply, deeply insulted. To the Algerian, bringing out a piece of paper was a direct slur on his personal honor, because in his culture, important issues are sealed with spoken, personal trust. It just goes to show what is considered entirely professional in one culture can be a massive insult in another.
And that brings us to part 4, building global trust. Creating psychological safety across diverse borders.
Look, if you can't establish that trust across cultures, you cannot do business, full stop. To build it, culturally fluent brands operate on the 4 C's. First is culture, actively engaging with the cultural trends and narratives of your audience. Second, community, building genuinely symbiotic partnerships, not just extracting money from a demographic. Third, communication, triggering inclusive two-way conversations, rather than just shouting your message from a megaphone. And fourth, consciousness. Modern brands actually have to act as agents that challenge inequality and drive genuinely inclusive innovation.
But how do you, as an individual leader, actually foster this trust day-to-day on your teams? There's a fascinating technique for this called active inquiry. It's part of a broader think, talk, create method. Active inquiry means intentionally slowing yourself down and asking open-ended, non-leading questions with a completely blank mind. It literally forces you to control your emotions, escaping that primitive fight-or-flight response in the brain. So instead of getting super defensive when someone from another culture challenges you, you replace that primitive reaction with thoughtful, highly inclusive dialogue. And the absolutely crucial point here is that using active inquiry in a we-centric mindset creates one vital thing: psychological safety. Google actually ran a massive analysis to figure out what makes teams perform at their absolute best. And surprise, surprise, it wasn't the highest salaries or the coolest office design. It was psychological safety. It's the feeling that team members can take risks, speak their minds, and be vulnerable without any fear of being shamed. When you successfully create this safety, it literally causes the biological release of oxytocin in the brain, creating this beautiful, self-nourishing cycle of trust, where employees feel incredibly safe to innovate.
So, what does this all mean for us? We've seen the deadly blindfolds that destroy companies. We've mapped out the different cultural orientations, and we now know exactly how to build psychological safety. The only question left is this: are you going to keep leading with a blindfold, clinging to outdated tunnel vision, or are you finally ready to raise your multicultural quotient and harness a we-centric, culturally fluent mindset? The global multiverse is already here. It's time to unlock your potential.